with all of you. Good times, good times. Pouring some unnamed orange beverage. We're all here. We're going to have a nice, interesting chat. You know, I often say that this chat is not intended to go for a long time, and then I end up talking for a long time. And then there's nights where I come on here with a big speech prepared, and we end up ending early. So I can't predict how long we'll go on tonight. I'll do my normal thing where I give my opening remarks, and then from there, I do the roll call, and then from there, I answer your super chat questions. That's how we do the show here. That's how we do it every time. We're doing a lot of late night shows lately, which that's it's starting to feel summer-ish. I mean, it's spring technically, but that's kind of a summer thing, right? Being up late at night. So maybe that's what's going on here. But I'll try to do some afternoon ones later this week. Different times are better for different folks, right? I mean, it's just that's how this works. Some nights it's better to do a late night, and but there's different people in different parts of the world. We got Australians watching, we got people in Beijing and in China watching, but we also got people in Germany and Britain and France and Russia and England and UK and Scotland watching. So, Ireland. So, it's different times work better for everybody, right? And who knows? So, there you go. There you go. Yeah. So, yeah, that's the way we'll do things. Be sure to hit the like button. Be sure to hit the subscribe button. Be sure to hit the notifications bell. We always want people to get their updates so that they become part of this. And post this on Facebook, post this on Twitter, post this on Reddit. Make this a great Saturday evening conversation. The more people here, the more fun we have. So, yeah, I will, in one quick moment, jump right into my opening remarks. But before I do that, I want to remind everyone to tune in a week from tomorrow, because we're having yet another Center for Political Innovation web conference, and it'll be a week from tomorrow. I believe, yes, a week from tomorrow. We'll be having a Center for Political Innovation web conference, and the topic will be marching into May Day, and that's what we're going to do, marching into May Day. It's going to be a lot of fun. So be absolutely sure to tune in next week, 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. That's going to be good. Earlier this week, I had the opportunity of streaming with Nico House. Nico House, he put it on his Rockfin, and I'm hoping that soon it'll be up on this channel. It was a great conversation I had with the folks at Nico House. It wasn't the folks, it was one guy. It's with Nico House, and we had a chat. Navalny, all right, so that's the first super chat there. We got Navalny. I'll talk about Navalny. Yeah, so with no further ado, Belarus, socialist. With no further ado, I'll jump right into my opening remarks. Folks, on April 9th, Friday, the country lost a very great individual. Very great individual, Upton Sinclair. And that individual was named Ramsey Clark. Ramsey Clark was the U.S. Attorney General in the administration of Lyndon Johnson. And he fought with the FBI. And he came from a family. His father was an attorney general. He was from Texas. And, he was young, and he was very much a Democrat and very much a supporter of the civil rights movement. And as U.S. Attorney General, he fought against the FBI. J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI were pushing COINTELPRO and going after the Black Panthers and such. And Ramsey Clark pushed back against them. And he actually refused to wiretap Stokely Carmichael, was leader of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. He faced a lot of flack. He was considered to be a radical. He released a lot of people from federal prison. And when Richard Nixon was running for president in 1969, Richard Nixon said, "The first thing I will do," 1968, "is when I get elected is fire Ramsey Clark." And that's what happened. Richard Nixon fired Ramsey Clark. So what did Ramsey Clark do? He got on a plane and he went to Vietnam. He went to Hanoi and he announced that the Vietnamese people and their struggle for national liberation, Ukraine, Donbass, and their struggle for national liberation, the people of Vietnam were right, and the U.S. imperialists were wrong. And Ramsey Clark, look, Ramsey Clark, he was former U.S. Attorney General, and after leaving the position of being U.S. Attorney General, Ramsey Clark became a tankie. I don't know how to put it any other way. I mean, I don't think he spoke of himself explicitly as a communist, but he did criticize capitalism. He did criticize American imperialism. But more than that, he stood with the anti-imperialists, and that in and of itself is worth 1,000 times more than any statement. There are a lot of people in the United States who say they're against imperialism, say they're against capitalism, but the second that any force emerges around the world, Donetsk, the second that any force emerges around the world that actually is anti-capitalist, they distance themselves from it. They oppose it. They're neutral. They're critical. That wasn't Ramsey Clark. 1979, when the Islamic Revolution of Iran happened, Ramsey Clark got on a plane. He went to Iran to support the Iranian people. He was an eyewitness to the Islamic Revolution of Iran. He was an eyewitness as an American. Got on a plane. At the time, the Iranian people are in revolt, chanting death to America. They're out in the streets overthrowing the Shah. Ramsey Clark got on a plane and he went to Iran to stand with the Islamic Revolution of Iran. Ramsey Clark made a point of defending in international court the people that the U.S. imperialists would try to demonize. Right? If they went after a leader from Africa, tried to accuse them of crimes, he would work in their defense because he knew who the real murderers and criminals were. As someone who was part of the U.S. Department of Justice, he knew who the real criminals and who the real murderers were. And he was there to tell the other side of the story. He organized a delegation of people to bring medicine to Iraq. At the time that Iraq was facing criminal sanctions, right? The Iraqi people were, suffering. The USA forbid, sorry about that. A little interesting that it cut out there. The USA forbid chlorine from going to Iraq. The USA wouldn't permit the Iraqi people to get chlorine to purify their water, and Iraqi children were dying in mass. I mean, they were just dying, and the sanctions were killing people. Ramsey Clark, he put together a delegation of people, and they made no secret about it. They went to the airport with big stacks of medicine that the U.S. government had said you're not allowed to give to the Iraqis, with all kinds of bottled water and all kinds of medical supplies and all kinds of food. All the things the U.S. government said the Iraqis, it was illegal to give the Iraqis. Ramsey Clark, former U.S. Attorney General, gathered, the press, and he announced, "I'm getting on this plane and I am taking all this medicine to Iraq in defiance of U.S. law." This is a legal challenge to a genocidal policy. And Ramsey Clark broke the U.S. law and brought medicine to Iraqi children and fed Iraqi people food and stood against the genocidal U.S. sanctions that were imposed. That was pretty bold, and he could have been prosecuted, and he wanted them to prosecute him. He was hoping they would prosecute him for doing it, because then he could use that to expose the illegal nature of the policy of the sanctions on Iraq that killed so many people. When the U.S. government bombed Yugoslavia and bombed Serbia, claiming that the leaders of Serbia were committing genocide, Ramsey Clark became the attorney representing Slobodan Milosevic in the International Criminal Court. and exposing that the real genocide was the United States that had armed the Kosovo Liberation Army and fomented civil war, and that yes, there may have been atrocities in that war, no doubt, but the claim that the leaders of Yugoslavia, the leaders of Serbia were genocidal, that was simply not accurate. And after Milosevic died, later the UN confirmed that that was actually correct. That yes, yeah, the idea that the government of Serbia was guilty of crimes, on the scale of the Nazis or something, was absurd. Ramsey Clark, he went on to become the attorney for Saddam Hussein, right? When the USA invaded Iraq, and staged a sham trial. You illegally invade a country with no legal grounds whatsoever. You overthrow the government. You then arrest the leader, and they put on a sham trial. And Ramsey Clark was the lawyer for Saddam Hussein, right? Ramsey Clark was an anti-imperialist to his core, right? And he was an anti-imperialist. He understood that the American imperialists, the American empire, were the main danger to humanity, and that the wars that are being threatened, by the imperialists, are a big danger. He was very afraid of nuclear weapons, and he was very much into enforcing international law when it came to U.S. leaders. And Ramsey Clark was a real hero. He pushed for the impeachment of George W. Bush. He was a real hero, um, and it is something I'm very proud of, that I did have the ability to interact with Ramsey Clark. I did work for the International Action Center. I was a member of the Workers' World Party, and the Workers' World Party was very key in setting up Ramsey Clark's anti-imperialist, nonprofit, anti-war, anti-capitalist organization. Ramsey Clark was the director of the International Action Center, an anti-war, anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist, organization. And I did work for the International Action Center, and so I did interact with Ramsey Clark on a number of occasions. I'm trying to, remember some of the interactions I had. I do remember that one thing I ended up doing a lot was delivering food to Ramsey Clark's house. Um, and what that was about was that Ramsey Clark spoke up about Syria, and he spoke up about how the U.S. government was arming terrorists. This was about 2013. And so a lot of Syrian Americans really agreed with him. So, as a gesture of kindness, they would send food to Ramsey Clark. So, they didn't know his home address. They did know where the office of the International Action Center was. So, one day we would just be at the office, and suddenly there would just be boxes and boxes and boxes of Syrian food delivered at the office. So, I would deliver some of it, and I got to eat some of it as well. And I would take it a few blocks over, and deliver that Syrian food to Ramsey Clark's apartment. Bring it to him. He had a daughter who he lived with, who was disabled, and he took care of her in his old age. He took care of his disabled daughter, and he lived with her in his apartment. And I would go over, and the doorman would meet me there, and I would say, "I'm Caleb. I'm here to see Ramsey Clark." And the doorman would say, "Oh, very good," and would escort me into the elevator. And I would come up there with a big box of Syrian food, and there would be Ramsey Clark at the door, and he'd be there, and he's a tall man, but he was old and kind of hunched over, and he'd say, thank you very much, thank you." Um, yeah. What else? I do remember we put together an 80th birthday celebration for Ramsey Clark on his 80th birthday. We had an international, like a gala, and there were a lot of foreign diplomats there. Ralph Nader was there. The ambassadors of Iran, the ambassadors of Syria, the ambassadors of North Korea, the UN representatives of almost every anti-imperialist country were there to honor Ramsey Clark. At Riverside Church, we put together this gala to honor Ramsey Clark. And I do remember that it was kind of funny because I was in my early 20s, and almost everyone there was 40, 50 years old. So it's kind of funny. I ended up at kind of a kid's table at this international gala for Ramsey Clark. It was kind of funny, but because I was in my mid 20s, Ramsey Clark's uh, granddaughters, who were teenagers at the time, They were seated with me. And me and a couple of, the young activists in the International Action Center. So I actually spent an evening having a meal sitting across from Ramsey Clark's granddaughters. And that was quite an interesting experience. I mean, imagine having your grandfather be the anti-imperialist former U.S. Attorney General who represented Milosevic and Saddam Hussein, who violated U.S. law to bring medicine to Iraqi children. It was quite an interesting experience to meet his two granddaughters. I don't know where they are now, and I don't even know if they remember me, but I did have a pleasant evening sitting across from them and engaging with them about what their life is like. They're certainly from a different strata of U.S. society than I am, and that's one of the good things is being able to meet people from different strata of U.S. society. You know, um, Ramsey Clark was very principled, very very principled. Michael Brooks, very very principled. What's interesting is he would work with a lot of different anti-imperialists. He worked with the Workers' World Party and the International Action Center. You know, but he was also he made a point of working. He worked with Lyndon LaRouche, also Lyndon LaRouche, the pro-China, pro-Russia, anti-imperialist, former Trotskyite, now rejects Marxism. He worked with them, and he represented Lyndon LaRouche when Lyndon LaRouche was put in prison on a frame-up for tax fraud or something like that, or credit card fraud, or it was like a frame-up. They imprisoned Lyndon LaRouche because of his, mainly it was probably he was targeted because of his ties to Saddam Hussein, his ties to Ba'athist Arab socialism, and his anti-war positions, his anti-war activism. And so when Lyndon LaRouche was put in prison, Ramsey Clark represented him. One thing that is interesting about that is that Lyndon LaRouche and Ramsey Clark were enemies at one point. You can watch videos of Lyndon LaRouche from the late 70s, just ranting against Ramsey Clark. And he I guess Lyndon LaRouche at that point believed that Ramsey Clark was at the center of some kind of international communist conspiracy or something like that. But it didn't matter, right? Lyndon LaRouche, when the U.S. government came after Lyndon LaRouche, they didn't come after him because of the bad things he'd said about Ramsey Clark. And Lyndon LaRouche in the 70s, he had said some really nasty things about Ramsey Clark. Had said Ramsey Clark was a traitor to the country and all kinds of stuff. I mean, and the LaRouche people had gone after Ramsey Clark quite a bit, but it didn't matter. Didn't matter. All right, writing it down. Didn't matter. When the U.S. government came after Ramsey Clark and came after Lyndon LaRouche, Ramsey Clark represented him. And that's how principled he was. That's how principled he was. It didn't matter that the LaRouche people had said all these negative things and tried to destroy his reputation. It didn't matter. He knew that the U.S. government had gone after Lyndon LaRouche because of his anti-imperialist positions, and so he he stepped up and defended him and became friends with Lyndon LaRouche. During the time he defended him, didn't agree with him politically. He didn't agree with the Workers' World Party politically. He had his own views. He was an anti-imperialist, but he was friendly with different people. He was friendly with different people. He had been friendly with the former president of Pakistan, the socialist leader Bhutto. Um, Decline of labor unions. You know, um, he had been friendly with many many important figures around the world. Ramsey Clark was a dynamic individual. The thumbnail for this video tonight is actually a time that I spoke at an event, a panel about Syria that Ramsey Clark, was the leader of. I was able to speak at it, and I actually gave a very short presentation where I said I put forward my four word peace plan for Syria, and it was cut off the money. But Ramsey Clark, he had a way of just being very, 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 very to the point and kind of humorous. He had a sense of humor. One thing I remember, I will never forget. All right, debtors, rather than workers. One thing that I remember about Ramsey Clark, that I thought was kind of amusing was I interviewed him for Press TV when I was working, I was doing journalism for Press TV. I was able, of course, to interview him because he was somebody I met. So I went to his apartment, and we set up two different cameras, and we set up lighting, big lights, and we set up in his living room in his apartment this really fancy equipment. We sat there, and I had all these very, very carefully thought out questions. So I sat there and I asked him a very complicated question, like, you as a former U.S. Attorney General, why did you take the stands you took? What was the It was a very long, complicated question. I was new at interviewing people. I hadn't interviewed people very much before, and this was a high-level interview I was getting. And so I sat there and I asked him this very, very complicated question about where he went. And he sat there, I remember this, Ramsey Clark sat there and he said, I'm against war. And I mean, it was beautiful. I mean, it was sweet. It was very, very sweet. There was just something sweet about it. Um, I hope I don't start crying, but it was just he was just a very genuine person. He was just a very, very genuine person. He was from Texas. He had this Texas Southern drawl, and he was from Texas, but he was an anti-imperialist, and he would start talking and be like, they are liars. The greatest mass murderers in the world are the imperialists and the Pentagon. They kill people all over the world. I mean, he felt it in his bones. He felt it in his bones. The anti-imperialism. I mean, this is a guy who had been inside the halls of empire. He had been inside. He had been in the halls. He had sat in the same room as Richard Nixon. He had sat in the same room as Lyndon Johnson. He had sat in the same room as the people who eventually murdered Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He had fought with J. Edgar Hoover. He knew how evil the American capitalists and imperialists really are. I mean, he knew in his bones. He saw that evil up close, and he made a moral choice, a moral decision that he wasn't going to be part of it, and that you have to think, right? I mean, it's one thing, I'm a guy from Ohio, and I've traveled to international conferences, I give speeches here and there, and I get worried about government repression, right? They say they believe in free speech and all of that. We know that's not the case. We know what they did to Fred Hampton, and we know what they've done to labor leaders and different voices. We know what they're doing to Assange right now. So, I get worried. I'm just on here rambling. I'm a kid from Ohio, and I was an activist, and I'm a journalist, and I just do my thing. But this is a guy he knew where the bodies were buried. You know what I mean? This guy had been in the same room. He was part of that clique, right? I mean, he sat behind closed doors, and he was part of their evil empire. And he made the decision to jump ship and to join the anti-imperialist camp. You know, um, he made the decision to join the other side. Um, and that was a huge risk. I mean, I don't know if they ever tried to kill Ramsey Clark. I don't know if they ever did. I wouldn't put it past him. Um, you know, um, I mean, he was somebody who had been on the inside of it, and that was the thing. And why did he do what he did? And this is the most important thing to remember is, 1968, the year when Ramsey Clark was pushed out, of the U.S. Attorney General's office. It looked like the communists were going to win the Cold War at that point. Um, the communists were going to win, and he wasn't the only government official in that time to have gone that route. They've covered it up, but there were others. There was a top CIA guy who defected to Cuba, and that there were a lot of people within the U.S. government, within the deep state apparatus, who said, you know what, the communists are right, the American imperialists are wrong, and did what Ramsey Clark did. He was not the only one to do that. Um, and they did it because they could see. They could see clearly the other side was going to win. The other side was right. It was raising people out of poverty, and the USA had nuclear weapons and was determined to just never let socialism emerge as an alternative to capitalism. And based on that, there were layers with it. There were a number of people within the American power structure who came to the conclusion that he came to, right? Um, and that was a long time ago. A lot of them are dead now, and Ramsey Clark is no longer with us. But he was certainly something special. And you can bet that they have all kinds of mechanisms now to make sure that something like Ramsey Clark doesn't happen again. I wrote that whole book about Kamala Harris and her personality and all of that. Kamala Harris, right? She was somebody who was a prosecutor. Ramsey Clark was also a prosecutor, a federal attorney. But he was somebody who realized what he was doing was wrong. I mean, he realized he was kind of like that. You ever hear the old popular American hymn "Amazing Grace"? You ever hear the hymn "Amazing Grace"? Right. The story from Amazing Grace is that there was a slave owner, a slave ship, a slave trader, and he was on his slave ship, and he was going to Africa, to grab some people and bring them back to the United States to be slaves. And there was a storm on the ship, and he feared for his life, and he knew that slavery was wrong. And amid this storm, he had a religious awakening and turned the ship around and stopped being a slave trader because he realized that slavery was wrong. That's Ramsey Clark. He was the U.S. Attorney General. He was in charge of the U.S. Department of Justice. He was in charge of the FBI that was wiretapping the civil rights movement and doing COINTELPRO. He was in charge of the U.S. federal prison apparatus where lives are destroyed, and he realized what was wrong, and he started doing everything he could from within to harm it, and letting people out of prison in big numbers, letting people out of prison, just releasing people out of prison. And then, trying to stop J. Edgar Hoover and wouldn't approve wiretaps of Stokely Carmichael. And from within the system, he awoke and he realized what was happening was wrong and tried his best to maintain his position and still try to stop things. And then, they caught on to him pretty quickly. And Nixon said, the first thing I will do is fire Ramsey Clark. He fired Ramsey Clark, and so he said, all right. And then the first thing he did is he got on that plane and he went to Vietnam. And he met with the communists in Vietnam with the National Liberation Front. And he said, you guys are right. This is your country, and you have the right to run it. This is somebody who is very, very rare, right? And we'll talk about Kamala and Pete. Kamala. It's really rare. It doesn't happen very much, but, it's pretty amazing. Ramsey Clark was a really dynamic individual. I'm really proud to have worked with him. I'm proud. I've got a photo of him. I've tweeted it out with Ramsey Clark. The thing is, that photo, I want to thank, if my friend who sent it to me, the person who took the picture is watching, thank you for sending it to me. You see, I never could get behind the selfie culture, okay? I never could get into the selfie culture. I went to Ramsey Clark's apartment on a number of occasions. I interviewed him for Press TV. I delivered food to him. I helped, build the 80th birthday gala. I sat there with his granddaughters and all this. But I never could get into the, famous person, click. It seemed tacky to me. You know what I'm saying? It seemed like a tacky thing to do. You don't do that, right? Yeah, and so I'll have opportunities, right? Andrew Yang. I'll have opportunities to get selfies with people, and I just don't feel right doing it. It just seems like a rude thing to do, to walk up to somebody and selfie with them, right? So, even though I had interacted with Ramsey Clark so many times, it hadn't been for my good comrade sending me that picture. I wouldn't have a photo record of it, right? I could go and try to dig up the Press TV interview somewhere, see if it's online. But Press TV's had their YouTube channel taken down a bunch of times, and but if it hadn't been for that, all right, DPRK. Hadn't been for that, I wouldn't even have had that picture. So, I'm happy that I have this photo. But at the same time, it's like, I just can't get into this selfie culture. This, here I am standing next to a famous person. I just, it's okay. And when people do it to me, I'm totally flattered, by the way. I've had people, oh, are you Caleb from RT Selfie? Are you Caleb, the communist guy on YouTube? Hey, good for you. I'm flattered. I'm deeply flattered. So don't worry. If you ever meet me in person and you want to do that with me, by all means, I'm not going to stop you. I'm not offended when people do it, but I just don't feel right doing it to other people. It's difficult for me to do. There's been times where I've been able to just kind of swallow my conservatism and just make myself do it because it's worth it, right? Larry King, right? I did it with Larry King, the CNN anchor. He was at the office one day, and I thought, I just need to get this, and so I selfied, and that was fine. And I've got selfies with certain people that I haven't put on the internet, right? I've saved them, right? And they're not selfies. I have photographs with some people that are rather notable, that I have not put on the internet. I've been advised not to advertise that I met certain people, and maybe someday those photos will be available. But right now, they are not. I've traveled around the world and I've met different people around the world. So I've never heard of that. I wrote it down. I've never heard of that. Never heard of that. But yeah, and I may not publish some of the photos of the people I've been selfied with. It's like you're not supposed to view people that way. I feel like it's kind of an insult, right? When you meet somebody, you should be valuing them for who they are, right? And when you pull your selfie phone out, you're just like, oh, you're a notch in my belt. You're a status symbol for me on social media. I don't care about you. I don't want to talk to you and ask you questions. I don't want to, tell you how I. Oh, no. You're my status symbol. Get over here. You're my trophy. Take a selfie. It's just a rude thing to do. And so I just cannot get in the habit of doing that. And I do have some selfies with famous people, but it always feels awkward when I do it. I always almost don't want to ask. It's like something about it is not right. So thank goodness that photo was sent to me. Thank you to my friend who sent that to me, because if not, I would not have had that photo, because I don't. You just don't do that, right? It's just not. I just don't feel right getting selfies with people. So there you go. But yeah, Ramsey Clark, another great interaction, right? I remember Riverside Church. We had a huge rally in Riverside Church. It's a very big church in Harlem, to stop the bombing of Libya. And the Nation of Islam and their people were there. God, I get emotional when I talk about Libya. Somebody in the comments just mentioned the Green Book, and so I have to talk about Libya. And I'm thinking about Ramsey Clark. I'm remembering things. And in Harlem, there's this very big church called Riverside Church. It's the church where Dr. Martin Luther King gave his speech condemning the Vietnam War, the Beyond Vietnam speech. USSR formation. And I remember, we had a very big meeting against the bombing of Libya at Riverside Church. And at that very big meeting, Ramsey Clark was there. Ramsey Clark went to Libya. And I'll never forget, he got up there in front of the audience, former U.S. Attorney General. He says, Gaddafi has done great things for Libya. He's done great things for the country, And he said, I've been to Benghazi, been to Tripoli, and based on, it's pretty clear if you go there that the people there, they support Gaddafi, right? He was just telling the truth. He said the people there, they support Gaddafi. And he said that. And there was this young Libyan woman, like a young Libyan college student, who had come to the meeting and was probably confused, right? She, on the one level, was probably angry about some of the conditions in her home country, but had opposed the bombing. And so when Ramsey Clark, said, it's pretty clear the people of Libya support Gaddafi, this 20-year-old girl stood up and she shouted, "No, we don't!" And he looked at her and said, "Well, I guess you don't." And she just was kind of embarrassed, and then she just left. It was weird. I think she'd intended it to be a disruption or something. "No, we don't." And he said, "Well, I guess you don't." And that's true, right? That 20-year-old college student probably had some legit grievances about Libya. Look, it's a developing country. A lot of corruption. Gaddafi, in order to stop counter-revolution, he had to put together some pretty nasty security services, right? Some pretty nasty security services that took care of business, right? That's the point that Michael Parenti always talks about. The Sandinistas, before they came to power, they talked against Stalinism. They didn't like the Soviet Union. It was Stalinist, but they believed in, they were not going to be Stalinists, blah, blah, blah. But then what happened, right? They took power, and immediately they're facing the counter-revolution. They had to put together a secret police. They had to put together their own KGB, right? And and that's Gaddafi, in order to stop the counter-revolution, right? In order to stop them from overthrowing him, he had to put together a nasty group of folks that would, and that was, and I'm sure that was awful, right? And that there was corruption in Libya for sure. So, this young woman that shouted at Ramsey Clark, no, we don't. She probably had some legit grievances. But Ramsey Clark was telling the truth. When Gaddafi was fighting the civil war in Libya, they would have demonstrations of millions of people waving the green flag and supporting Gaddafi. Gaddafi was one of the most popular leaders, and the revolutionaries, most of them weren't even from Libya. They were from other parts of the world. They were Al Qaeda. They were his Muslim Brotherhood types, and so there you go. But remember at that event at Riverside Church where Ramsey Clark spoke about Libya? He'd just gotten back from Libya. All right, EU and U.S. imperialism. He'd just gotten back from Libya, and one thing I remember was Cynthia McKinney, the congresswoman. She was there. The Nation of Islam, the organization of Minister Louis Farrakhan, they were there. And all the Trotskyites were not there. All the anarchists were not there. All these forces that claim to be anti-imperialist just couldn't bring themselves to support Gaddafi. Just couldn't bring themselves to stand against the bombing of Libya. But this whole room, there were lots of black nationalists. There were lots of tankies, MLs. They could stand against it. So yeah, that was pretty special. They would have that forum for Libya. So Ramsey Clark was a great human being. Great human being. So I got just another item to comment on, because it's like every so often there's a news item. There's a news item that it's like, if you don't see it, if you don't see the truth, you almost like, you see a news item and it's like so in your face what's going on, but people don't see it. People don't understand it. So we now know the number 2 man in ISIS, the number 2 man in the ISIS terrorist group. Remember that, that horrific terrorist group that cuts people's heads off and makes those horrific videos of drowning people in cages? No such thing. I don't endorse that pair. This horrific terrorist group, ISIS, Islamic State, ISIL, right, Daesh, whatever you want to call them. Awful, awful organization. We now know the number 2 man in the group was at one point a U.S. prison informer. He was an Iraqi who was arrested and in prison. And in prison, the U.S. government cultivated him as a prison informer and was using him to inform on other prisoners. He was basically recruited to spy on other prisoners. He was rewarded for it, and eventually he got released. And after he got released, he just happened to form this group, this violent group of Wahhabi terrorist extremists that might be tied to Saudi Arabia, that went to Syria and tried to fight against the Syrian government. Now, this is now it's public information. Washington Post is confirming this, that the number 2 man in ISIS was somebody that the U.S. government had cultivated as an informant in the Iraqi prisons. Now, look, it's right there, right? The U.S. government was arming Wahhabi terrorists and religious fanatics in Syria to try and overthrow the Syrian Arab Republic. And just so happens that, this fanatical terrorist, religious organization called ISIS emerges in Syria and in Iraq. Um, Interesting. And now we know that the number two man in the group was actually a someone that was cultivated as an informer in U.S. prisons. Now, it's like, again, I've said many, many times, it's really obvious the U.S. is not fighting a war on terror. It's fighting a war against the governments that fight terrorists. It's the U.S. government operates as Al Qaeda's air force. Instead of fighting the terrorists, we fight secular, nationalist, and socialist and anti-imperialist governments. And as a result of doing that, the terrorist groups get stronger. We overthrew the Ba'ath Arab Socialist government of Iraq, and now the terrorist groups there are stronger. We overthrew, we overthrew the government of Libya, and now the terrorist groups there are much stronger, right? Among the terrorists in Libya that overthrew Gaddafi was the Manchester bomber, right? Did you know that? The guy who blew up the Manchester concert, he had been given weapons and guns by the US and UK government to fight against Gaddafi, right? We know that ISIS terrorists that do those horrific things, they emerged from the very very the very forces the U.S. government was arming in Syria to fight against Assad, the secular government. This is just a pattern, and now we have yet another smoking gun, which is what I've been saying, right? That we're not really fighting a war on terror. The terrorists make useful proxies against anti-imperialism. And that's really what it gets down to. Zbigniew Brzezinski started this policy. He started in Afghanistan, right, where he worked with a young Saudi named Osama bin Laden to fight against the Soviet Union in Afghanistan. The U.S. government was arming Chechen separatists to try and break Chechnya away from the Soviet Union. And there's a whole pattern of this, right? And we're seeing it yet again. Yet again, we're seeing this. Yet again, we are seeing this. So, if you don't see it now, don't know what I can tell you, but yeah, we now know that the number two man in ISIS was also a U.S. prison informer. So there you go. But yeah, so that's my opening remarks for tonight. Not too long for the opening remarks. So hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, hit the notifications bell. And why don't we now do the roll call, names and locations? Names and locations. Who's with us tonight? Names and locations. Names and locations. I will call you out as I see you. I will drink more unnamed orange beverage. And then I'll answer your super chat questions. And then that's our show. So there you go. Charles in Chicago, Brazil, Queens, New York City, Jeffrey in France, Nassau County, Char Darling, Cole from Calgary, Ryan in California, Tristan from Maryland, Clydebank, Lexington, Massachusetts, Marta in Poland, Montreal, pray for Ramsey's soul. Oh, very sweet. Queens, New York, Holly Horn, right? Pyongyang, North Korea. That's great. Can't even list how many countries are being attacked by the U.S. right now. Colony of New Zealand, Detroit, Michigan, Keaton Mansfield. Welcome, Keaton. Keaton's a good friend of the program, great friend of the program. Does the DPRK look to China as an inspiration for its socialist model? DPRK look to China. Alrighty, question mark. Oh wow, a lot. They're just going by. I got to roll it back here so I can go over Branson, Missouri, the Humble Heights of Vermont, Brazil, San Jose, Portland, Oregon, Los Angeles, Springfield, Missouri, right? Calgary, Canada, NYC, Io Hillary, good friend of the program, John in Houston, California, Huachuca City, Arizona, Mo in Toronto, Canada, Chile, Miguel in Puerto Rico, UK, Scott, Los Angeles, Pyongyang, Grand Canyon, Arizona, JT24 in Mississippi, Washington, West Palm Beach, Sacramento, Mario in Croatia, Virginia, Jersey City, West Palm Beach, Springfield, Missouri, Bermuda, Jenny Lynn in Cincinnati, good friend of the program, Nashville, San Diego, San Miguel de Allende, Mexico, West Palm Beach, Los Angeles, Jeff. Hey, Caleb. Hey, back to you, Jeff. West Virginia, Redneck Red, West Palm Beach, Austin, Texas, very good. Albany, New York, West Palm Beach, Martin Iyer, right? Joe from Bikini Bottom, okay. Auckland, New Zealand. Mohsen from Iran. Alameda, California. Kieran from San Diego. Bay Area, California. Frank, very good. Nate from Chicago. Philly from San Diego. De Pere, Wisconsin. Las Vegas. Pomona, California. M in Philadelphia. Winlock, Washington, watching with my wife, Mary, tonight. Well, great, very good. Ryan from Madison, Wisconsin. Quebec City, Alexandria, Virginia. Glasgow, Scotland. Bay Area, California. Texas, DPRK, Canterlot, Cleveland. Springfield, Missouri. Adelaide, Australia. West Virginia, Tampa, Florida. Nazare, Covina, California. Terre Haute, Indiana, Denver, Colorado, Los Angeles, California, Republic of Glasgow, Florida, Ireland, supposedly North Korea lives mostly by making boots for Japan. Okay, I never heard that before. Albuquerque, New Mexico, Bermuda, Wilmington, Delaware, New Hampshire, Ram from Charlotte, Dario and Tamara in Brooklyn. Very good. Out on the town tonight, says Kinky. Well, very good. Congratulations for your night out on the town, Kinky. Kendall from San Diego. Nashville, Bay Area. Nate from Sydney, Australia. Very, very good. Someone's from Elmau. Just kidding. All right, Rhode Island. Rhode Island. Frank in Rhode Island. Very, very good. Anybody else? Names and locations? Troy in the city of the people of the South Wind, aka Kansas City, Arizona, Los Angeles. I did reply. I'm not going to answer anything about silly. There's that super chat is silly. Parma, Ohio, Maine. So there you go. Right. There is no Caleb Maupin thought, except for the thoughts in my mind. Right. But they're private. But anyway. No, but seriously, I mean, there you go. But anyway, so now we're going to Los Angeles, Paragus, James Graham. All right, very good. All right, so now we are going to do the super chats and keep the super chats rolling in. Hey, even the guy who asked that question about Caleb Maupin thought, which kind of came across like he was trying to make fun of me, but even still, I gave him an answer. I did give an answer. And if you do give a super chat, I will give you an answer. Like I said, like you just saw with the Caleb Maupin thought thing, it may not be the answer you wanted. I'm sure he wanted me to go on an egotistical rant about my new synthesis and ideology and look like a complete fool so he could, suck in his bong and go, yeah, what a weirdo, or something like that. Who knows what your intentions were, good sir. I apologize. I shouldn't assume. Maybe you were completely legitimate in asking that question. I shouldn't assume your intentions. It's very hard to tell sarcasm and mockery and not these days. You never know. Yeah, we can talk about the RCP. That's a good super chat question. RCP, Bob Avakian. Yeah, we can talk about that. All right, very good. Wrote it down. But yeah, if you got any more super chat questions, by all means, I say Caleb Maupin thought unironically, says Quinn. Well, there you go. Right? Who can argue with you? But yeah, keep the super chats rolling in and I'll answer them. So let's answer them. Let's start with Navalny. Who is Alexei Navalny? Alexei Navalny is a white nationalist. He's an ethno-nationalist. He basically considers the people of the Caucasus Mountains to be an inferior race. And he has gotten a gig of, he's the U.S. media and Western imperialism's favorite dissident in Russia. He has no chance of ever winning. He's not loved in the country. Far out, man. Past the. I don't know how you want me to reply to that, old gringo. Far out, man. Are you sure it's far out? But anyway, yeah, he's gotten the gig as being the U.S. media's favorite dissident in Russia. And there are some young people who are frustrated with things in the country like corruption and such who fall under his spell. But ultimately, he works for Western imperialism. He serves neoliberalism. And the worst part is he's got a history, a record as a neo-Nazi, according to the New York Times and all these other outfits. Yet you'll notice all the synthetic left, all the phony pro-imperialist left, Jabba the Vosh, Skippy the Bear, they all love Navalny. Why? Because he's pro-imperialist, right? You only get called a Nazbol if you're anti-imperialist, right? And Navalny is pro-imperialist. The Western imperialists love him, so they love him also because they're complete hypocrites. They're shills. Alrighty. Is Belarus socialist? Yes, Belarus, I would argue, is a socialist country. They never had a full counter-revolution. When the rest of the Soviet Union was having socialism be dismantled, you had the election of the leader of Belarus, Lukashenko. Lukashenko was pro-Soviet. He praised Stalin, and he never privatized the industries. The Communist Party is the biggest political party in Belarus. Unfortunately, they're not too good on LGBT stuff, and there's some anti-Semitism, and that's not cool. But in terms of the economic system, I mean, the banks, factories, and industries of Belarus are organized to serve public good, not profits. They don't have free market capitalism there. It's a state-run economy. There's some markets, but overall, they have universal employment, universal education, central planning, and yeah, I would say Belarus is a socialist country. And there's probably things in the country that need to be updated, and there's legit frustrations that people have. I know Lukashenko has negotiated with some of the student protesters, and I hope that they're able to reach a resolution that's good. But overall, yes, I would say Belarus is a socialist country, and what we can learn from the latest crisis in Belarus, what we can learn from it is that Belarus and Russia, they've gotten along real well in the past, but over the last couple of years there was some differences in the country, right? Belarus started being more critical of the United States or of Russia, and started kind of being friendly to the United States. And what happened? Then the USA took advantage of the elections and tried to stir up a color revolution, right? And that's the same thing that happened with Libya, right? Gaddafi was getting friendly to the United States under Obama, and he called Obama his little African son, and Obama made a deal, and BP signed a deal, and they made a deal, and look what happened, right? Look what happened in Libya. And that's the thing. The United States, they sometimes, when they're trying to manipulate socialist countries against each other, when they're trying to maneuver and manipulate, they will they will suck up to some socialist countries and get friendly, but then what do? They stab them in the back, and they did it to Belarus, and they did it to Gaddafi. And so I hope that other socialist countries will realize you don't get anything from collaborating with the empire. It's like making a deal with the devil. It's like Faust, right? It's like that evil genie. You ever remember that evil genie, right? The genie says, I'll give you anything you want. So you wish for a mountain of gold, and then suddenly you're buried under a mountain of gold, right? That's collaborating with the U.S. imperialists. Okay, but seriously, praxis is small, everyday, simple ways, looking for ideas. I don't know what that means, old gringo. You're looking, praxis ideas. That's what I'll write down, praxis ideas. Alrighty. All right, Upton Sinclair, people in the third world mourning Prince Philip. All right, third world mourning Prince Philip hegemony. All right. I'll definitely answer that. I.O. Hillary. Upton Sinclair. Upton Sinclair. He was a very famous novelist who was a leftist novelist. He wrote novels about capitalism and greed and supporting the labor movement. His most famous novel was called The Jungle, and it was about meatpacking workers of Lithuanian descent, and how they were mistreated. I don't talk about people I work with, Frank, so I work with him. I don't talk about that. All right. Dostoevsky, and Solzhenitsyn. Socialism. Upton Sinclair, he wrote The Jungle. Unfortunately, there is some racism in The Jungle. There is, they refer to, because black people were very anti-union, right? Because the unions were racist back in 1900. The unions were whites only. And so a lot of black people hated unions because unions kept black people from getting jobs. So when there would be a strike, often black people would volunteer to be scab labor. Okay. How can we? Right? How can we help? Very good question, and you will get an answer. And so in response to that, there is a very, very racist passage in Upton Sinclair's novel *The Jungle*. A very, very racist passage in the book. It's overall a pretty good socialist book, but that racist passage kind of cancels out some of the good things of the book. But Upton Sinclair, he was, and actually what's pretty wild is in the late 30s, Upton Sinclair, he never joined the Communist Party. He'd been in the Socialist Party. But in the late 30s, Upton Sinclair actually came out against Trotsky. When Trotsky was convicted at the Moscow trials, Upton Sinclair made a statement in support of the Stalin, crackdown on Trotskyism, which is pretty bold. But that shows how influential the Communist Party and the Soviet Union were in the global anti-fascist camp. But Upton Sinclair was a very important novelist. He almost became the governor of California at one point, from what I understand. He ran on a platform and he almost got elected. And they worked very hard to prevent him from being elected because he was quite popular in California. He comes out of the period where they referred to the muckrakers. They called them muckrakers, and they were people that exposed the evils of U.S. society. Ida Tarbell, Ida Tarbell was very famous for that. And it was like journalists who exposed things like child labor, things like, corruption in the government and such. Lincoln Steffens was another very famous muckraker. Lincoln Steffens. And Lincoln Steffens, he was this famous muckraker journalist who was hung out with Upton Sinclair and Ida Tarbell and others. And he gave the very famous quotation. He went and visited the Soviet Union right after the Russian Revolution. And when Lincoln Steffens got off the plane, the reporters were all there to ask Lincoln Steffens, "What did you see in Soviet Russia, Lincoln Steffens?" And he said to the reporters, "I've seen the future and it works." That was his quote. "I've seen the future and it works." And that was Lincoln Steffens. That was his assessment of the Soviet Union. And he was pretty pro-Soviet. It was pretty sympathetic to communism, Lincoln Steffens. He'd been this famous journalist, muckraker, pro-labor guy. And when he got back from the Soviet Union, he said, "I've seen the future and it works." What's funny is when I first read that phrase, I'm like, wait, I've heard that somewhere. It comes from the, I had never heard this phrase of Lincoln Steffens until I read it. But it turns out I had heard the phrase, "I've seen the future and it works," because Prince, the 1980s musician, did a song called "The Future" where he made music out of that. "I've seen the future and it works." He turned that into a song. I had no idea that was a quote about the Soviet Union. So there you go. "I've seen the future and it works." But yeah, that was Lincoln Steffens. So that's where Upton Sinclair comes out of. He comes out of the muckrakers. And supposedly we didn't get workers' rights from him, unfortunately. I mean, I'm sure he made a contribution. But actually, one thing that's directly attributed to Upton Sinclair is health and safety, the Department of Food and Drug Administration. Apparently, the president of the United States, this book, "The Jungle" by Upton Sinclair, about meatpacking facilities and how badly the meatpacking workers are treated, was a bestseller. So the president of the United States, I forget which president it was, Woodrow Wilson or Taft or one of them, was eating a ham sandwich while his staffers were reading him the novel "The Jungle" by Upton Sinclair. And so it was Howard Taft or Woodrow Wilson or one of these presidents, and he's reading him this book about meat packers and how they're treated in their facilities. What's also in the book, I don't know that name. What's also in the book is it talks about kind of the grossness, the unsanitary way meat is created, how dirty the facilities are, the rats and all of that. So the president of the United States was eating a ham sandwich. He's biting into his ham sandwich while they're reading him this novel about how the meat packing facilities are full of rats and spiders and it's gross. So the president almost throws up. He's like, "I'm eating meat here." And so apparently, the president of the United States didn't care very much about the working conditions and how working class people were being treated in the meatpacking facilities. But he was really worried about eating, rats and bugs and stuff like that. And so he passed. Apparently, he ordered some health and safety regulations for the American meat packing facilities. So that's like the first health and safety regulations or something came from that. That's it's kind of a silly story, but yeah, it was actually William Z. Foster who first unionized the packing houses of Chicago, the meat packing houses. But I guess that's how we got some of the first food safety regulations was from Upton Sinclair grossing out the president. That's where it came from. So there you go. All right, Ukraine, Donbass. Look, the situation in Ukraine is very, very dangerous. It's very, very dangerous. 2014, the U.S. government, they staged a movement. They staged a movement to overthrow the Ukrainian elected leader. Yanukovych was toppled in a coup. This group of fanatical extremists who were, they toppled the Ukrainian government. The ultra nationalists and Euromaidan and all of that. There is now an openly Nazi division of the Ukrainian military, the Azov Battalion, and they march with like Nazi symbols. I saw the super chat. I don't know who that is. They march, with fascist insignia, and they've overthrown the Ukrainian government. They display the Confederate flag, the U.S. Confederate flag, and the Celtic cross of the Ku Klux Klan is one of their symbols, and the eastern regions, Donbass, and I'll answer. I'm basically answering it all in one fell swoop here. In Donetsk, Luhansk, the Donbass region, Novorossiya, the people there, they overthrew. They basically declared independence, and they declared that they're not going to be part of it. Right, and when they banned the speaking of the Russian language in school, even though that's what the people in the eastern regions of Ukraine speak, they declared independence. Now, Crimea also voted to join with Russia. Right, Crimea, when the Soviet Union fell. The agreement was that Ukraine would get Crimea, but Russia would get to keep their military base there because it's a very important military base for Russia. And Crimea is not a big place. I've been to Crimea, actually. I attended the Yalta Economic Forum. I've been to Crimea, and it's a very small place, not a very big peninsula. So I was in Crimea, and I mean, there's not much there other than a Russian military base and such. And I mean, there's people who live there. So most of the people there are tied to the Russian government, speak Russian as their language, etc. And so when the government in Kiev in Ukraine, this hostile anti-Russian government emerged in 2014, installed by the U.S. government. At that point, the people of Crimea voted. They took a democratic vote, and they joined with Russia. And it's funny because people say Russia invaded Crimea. No, the military of Russia was already there, right? Invasion means you like march the troops in. The troops were already there. Russia already had their military base there, right? And they had, the treaty gave them it's and Crimea is a beautiful place. It really is beautiful. I hope I get a chance to go back. The beach, resorts there, and it's so lovely. It's really a peaceful place. The trees and it's got a special feel to it. Crimea is really, really special. I'll tell you that much. It's a very, very special place. And it was, and well, yeah, but anyway, so, so Crimea voted to join with Russia. These other, Donetsk, Luhansk, they voted to separate. They voted to be independent people's republics. They've united into Novorossiya. And the areas, they're run by communists, actually. The communist parties tends to be very, very powerful in these areas. And most of these governments in Donetsk, the Donetsk People's Republic, Luhansk People's Republic, the Communist Party is the legit party, and there are pictures of Lenin and pictures of Stalin, on display, and it's like, and so it looks like there may be war there again. Things are intensifying right now, and so it's something to definitely pay attention to. I've never been to the eastern regions of Ukraine. But there are a number of people I know who have been there, and and have talked with people, and I've met with Ukrainian exiles, people that had to flee, for their lives when the coup happened. And the Communist Party of Ukraine, in the regions that are controlled by the pro-Western government, it's pretty much been wiped out. I mean, the Progressive Socialist Party and such. I mean, the people of Ukraine are really, really. I mean, it was an overthrow of democracy. It was a polarization. It wasn't good. And now we want peace in that area. Have you considered writing theory? Is market socialism the only way forward? All right, market socialism, only way forward. Writing theory. So there you go. But yeah, I mean, we should be very, very concerned about it. There have been some new developments there, and we want peace, right? We want peace, right? The Minsk agreement was made, and it should be abided by, and that's that. All right, cool, and that takes care of two more there. Okay, Justice Democrats, have they sold out? I don't know if it's a matter of sold out. I mean, the Justice Democrats were never communists. They were never socialists. They were never Marxist Leninists or anything like that. They were Democrats who were slightly more liberal, than the rest of the Democratic Party. I believe Justice Democrats is associated with Young Turks. Now, DSA, Democratic Socialists of America, and Justice Democrats are two separate things. Justice Democrats never called themselves socialists. They were just kind of more progressive, right? They were more Bernie Sanders-ish than others. DSA is actually like an attempt to have some kind of social democratic or Marxian grouping. I mean, we're seeing a situation where Jimmy Dore has called them out. People are very upset about AOC, having the police come to the home of somebody who criticized her opinions on Palestine. Um, I mean, they went after Jimmy Dore. How dare he, push his raise the, his what's it called? How dare he ever push, force the vote? And you would have thought, I mean, they went after him viciously, and they're pushing this idea that anyone who's critical of the Democrats from the left is secretly a Trump conspiracy theorist, Russian or something. And yeah, I mean, it's unfortunate, but that doesn't mean there's probably a lot of very good people in the Justice Democrats, who may not agree with it. So there you go. Michael Brooks. I mean, he was a great voice on social media. He was critical of the RussiaGate stuff, and he was a very important progressive voice who died rather tragically and kind of suddenly. Very, very sad what happened there. The decline of labor unions. Well, right now, most labor unions represent a very low percentage of the U.S. workforce, and most of the people that labor unions represent are public employees, right? It's teachers, it's government workers, etc. And I believe largely that is due to the fact that the labor bureaucracy, that the labor bureaucracy of the United States doesn't want to take risks. When you unionize a company, right? That when you unionize a big company, that it's a big risk. It's a big risk. You have to invest a lot of money in that union drive. You might not win. Plus, that company is going to retaliate against you, right? It's almost an act of militancy, on the part of labor unions to go and unionize a company. I think the last big unionization of a company, of a major company in the United States, was UPS. When the Teamsters unionized UPS, that was in the 1990s. I think that was the last big victory for the labor movement, right? In the 1930s, there was a struggle to unionize the steel mills, unionize the auto workers and stuff. The last big victory, I think, was in the 90s when Ron Carey of the Teamsters unionized UPS. And look what happened. The Clinton administration went after him and drove him out of the Teamsters union. And I mean, there was a lot of retaliation. When you force a big company to sign a union contract, they're going to lose money, right? And they're going to lose money. They're going to have to negotiate. They don't like that, right? There's retaliation usually. I mean, this is why people have died. This is the story of the labor movement, right? And that the labor movement, the way it's been victorious, is by taking risks, taking risks. I mean, and that's how these things work. All righty. Um, debtors rather than workers. Well, look, debt is a reality of how capitalism in our time works. I mean, and the working class people are forced to get into debt, and debt is a way of controlling people and such. But I guess the relationship to the means of production is workers sell their labor power, right? They sell their labor power to a boss. So I mean, I wouldn't be for replacing debtors with workers, but we should point out that debt is used to control people. Someone asked about Kamala Harris and Pete Buttigieg both having leftist parents. Well, it's interesting because, Kamala Harris, her father is Donald Harris. He's a Marxian economist. He taught at Stanford University, and he was an advisor to the government of Michael Manley, the Prime Minister of Jamaica. Um, he and Kamala are estranged from each other. Kamala hates her father. He denounced her campaign. Um, he said he wanted to disassociate from her campaign, which he called a travesty of identity politics. That's Kamala idealizes her mother and she hates her father. And her father doesn't like her either. And Pete Buttigieg, on the other hand, his father is very supportive of him. And Pete Buttigieg's father, he was at the university in Indiana, and Pete Buttigieg's father is the head of the International Gramsci Society of Antonio Gramsci, and that's a little bit of a different situation. Antonio Gramsci was like that was the cultural critique that was like big with the Frankfurt School, and the CIA poured a lot of money into promoting Gramsci and studying of Gramsci and such, and the cultural critique. And Pete Buttigieg, father, he's not a Marxist economist. He's a Gramsci scholar, a critic of culture, someone who's associated with the Frankfurt School. And the CIA poured lots of money into that. And the International Gramsci Society has been part of, that whole Congress for Cultural Freedom effort to manipulate Marxism. So that's an important thing. All right. Andrew Yang. He may be the mayor of this city very soon. I mean, I think he's an interesting figure. He's got Bonapartist potential for sure. There are many things he says I don't agree with. There are some things that, I mean, look, giving people universal basic income would be a good thing at this point, right? It's not the answer, but I mean, it's better than nothing, right? I wouldn't want people to not have an income and starve, right? But ultimately, we need socialism. I mean, and Andrew Yang, I mean, there's some things that he pushes that are kind of libertarian and neoliberal. There are other things that he pushed that seem almost kind of socialistic. He's kind of a Bonapartist figure. He wants to utilize state power a little bit more, so it's interesting. Is the DPRK the last bastion of existing socialism? Well, they're having big economic problems right now in the DPRK. I mean, the sanctions are really hurting them combined with the pandemic. And I mean, they would like to have more of a market sector, from what I understand. But even they do their thing. They do things their own way. I wouldn't say that they're the last bastion of existing socialism. They do things their own way. I mean, they have their own methods. They trade with countries. They do things the Soviet Union didn't do. I wouldn't say that they're following the Soviet model exactly, because you can't. I mean, the Cold War is over. Commie-Con is over. So I wouldn't call it that. They have their own system. They'd like to be more market oriented, but they can't because of the sanctions. So someone said something about Ramsey Clark defending Nazis. I've never heard of that. I know, I mean, some people consider Lyndon LaRouche to be on the right or slur him that way, but that's not accurate. Lyndon LaRouche is not a fascist or a Nazi. He's just Lyndon LaRouche. I mean, they have their own views. But I haven't heard about him defending Nazis. But I mean, look. I will say this, which is that we shouldn't be trusting the capitalist government to silence people, right? Look, I mean, the Holocaust happened. It's a reality, and Holocaust denial is sickening and it's stupid, right? Because it's like I mean, you read it, and a lot of it is so pathetic. I mean, it's just people coming to a conclusion that they want to hear. So Holocaust denial is awful, but they banned Holocaust denial in Europe, right? In European countries, you cannot deny the Holocaust. You cannot deny the Holocaust, right? You can't do it. And now in Poland and in Czechoslovakia, they've expanded that. So not only can you not deny the Holocaust, but you can't question all the anti-communism, right? Just like it's illegal to say good things about the Nazis. Now it's illegal to say good things about communists, right? And all the fake leftists think communists and Nazis are the same. And look, you let that happen. You cannot trust the capitalist government to silence people. You can't, right? I mean, look, when the capitalist government is gonna silence people, do you think they're not going to use it against us? That is what I've been trying to urge the synthetic leftists. It's like these people, it does never occurs to them that we're the bad guys in the narrative of American imperialism, right? We're trying to dismantle their system and create a society where the banks, factories, and industries are organized for public good, not profits. We want to completely change the U.S. economy, right? We want to dismantle imperialism. I mean, we're the bad guys as far as they're concerned. So if you give them the power to silence people, right, on the basis of their of disagreements about history or something, they will use it against us, right? And of course, it sounds good to use it against Nazis. Holocaust denial is dumb and right racist and offensive, and I'd like Holocaust deniers to be shut up. But if you give that power to the capitalist state, they then use it against communists, and they are already doing that in European Union countries. Various European Union countries are already doing that, right? And you saw it, right? I mean, anyone, Vosh wants people to believe that anyone who questions what the government is saying about Uyghurs, anyone who doesn't agree with Radio Free Asia, is the same as a Holocaust denier, right? It's by introducing this certain things you're not allowed to argue. Well, no, I mean, and no, I am very opposed to Holocaust denial, but giving the capitalist state the ability to outlaw it opens the door to them outlawing other things and other controversies, right? So there you go, right? So and Ramsey Clark very much understood that. He had been the U.S. Attorney General, and he knew very well, how these people think behind the door, and there you go, yeah. Um, there you go. So, yeah, the formation of the USSR. Well, I mean, you had the Russian Revolution of 1917. Out of that, you get the government of Soviet Russia. But, Lenin was very much in favor of self-determination, right? He wanted nationalities to have self-determination. So as different regions, were brought into the Soviet Union, they were granted national autonomy. So you had Soviet Russia, then you had Soviet Ukraine, then you had Moldova, etc. And so it was the USSR. I believe it was in 1921. They declared the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, so that all of these national minorities could have their representation. A lot of these people throughout the former Soviet Union would never have had their own written language if it weren't for the Soviet Union, right? And the emphasis the Bolsheviks put on self-determination for national minorities. All right, EU and U.S. imperialism. There is increased tension. Look, what's going on right now with their efforts to kill the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. That is really unprecedented. And Britain is out of the European Union. And the EU countries are getting a little fed up with the USA trying to tell them who they can buy natural gas from. And the US government has gone over the top to try and kill the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. And a lot of European Union countries ain't happy about it. All right. Does the DPRK look to China? I don't think so. I think that there is a relationship, I mean, between the two countries, and but I think that the DPRK has its own views and its own perspective, and they have a relationship with China, they have a relationship with Russia, with Cuba, with Vietnam, with other anti-imperialist countries. But at the end of the day, they have their own perspective, right? And China doesn't agree with their nuclear weapons program. China very much believes in the Non-Proliferation Treaty. So does Russia. So Russia and China, seeing North Korea pull out of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, they both strongly disapproved of them doing that. So, and they have allowed sanctions on North Korea as a result of that, because they want to keep the Non-Proliferation Treaty intact. So there you go. RCP and Bobavakian. Well, it's interesting because the Revolutionary Communist Party, it's led by a guy named Bobavakian. They have an interesting history. They were probably the biggest formation of what you can call what's generally referred to as the new communist movement. So in the 1970s, you had 1968, 1969, you had an upsurge of anti-war activism, you had the Black Panther Party emerging and such. So there were a lot of young people that were, inspired by the Black Panthers, inspired by the Vietnamese National Liberation Front, and were interested in communism. And, we're becoming communists. A lot of student activists were getting into communism. There was a big activist group called Students for a Democratic Society, SDS. And so Students for a Democratic Society divided into, at first, two factions. The first, faction was led by the Progressive Labor Party, and they were called the Workers' Student Alliance, and they very much took the position that Black Panthers were what they called black fascists. They didn't like black nationalism. They didn't like the Black Panthers, and they thought the Vietnamese, were not true communists or whatever. That was the Progressive Labor Party. But there was this other faction in Students for a Democratic Society that did support the Black Panthers and did support the Vietnamese National Liberation Front. And they were called the Revolutionary Youth Movement, RYM. And they wrote a manifesto called "You Don't Need a Weatherman to Know Which Way the Wind Blows," that's what it was called. They were nicknamed the Weatherman faction. They were the slightly smaller faction of SDS that supported the Black Panthers and supported the Vietnamese people. But then there was a divide because the leaders of the Revolutionary Youth Movement, Bernardine Dorn, Bill Ayers, Mark Rudd, people like that, they advocated ultra-left street fighting. They basically they embraced hippie counterculture, and they basically advocated young people becoming hippies, using drugs, and being violent in the streets. And there were many people in the Revolutionary Youth Movement faction of SDS who didn't agree with that. And they basically said, look, ultra-left adventurism is not the answer. And what was interesting was the Black Panthers also were against the Weathermen. When the Weathermen called this rally called the Days of Rage in Chicago, the Black Panthers denounced it. So the group of people within the Revolutionary Youth Movement who rejected the ultra-left adventurism and the hippie counterculture and the violence of the Weathermen, they were called Revolutionary Youth Movement 2. We're talking about that right now, old gringo. They were called Revolutionary Youth Movement 2, but I can give that special attention. And Revolutionary Youth Movement 2, Bob Avakian was a leader of the Bay Area from San Francisco, Bay Area. He was part of the Revolutionary Youth Movement 2. Mike Klonsky, whose father had been a leader of the Communist Party in New York City, and Mike Klonsky was this young guy who was a Maoist. He became part of Revolutionary Youth Movement 2. There were there was Revolutionary Youth Movement 2. And they were aligned with the Black Panthers, and they did kind of what you're supposed to do. They got jobs in factories and working class neighborhoods. They organized peaceful demonstrations, and they tried to win white working class people who were sympathetic to white working class people in working class neighborhoods who worked in factories, to win them to communism, win them to support the Black Panthers, win them to support anti-imperialism and stuff. And it was the new communist movement of the 1970s, And I actually have a class on the history of the new communist movement. It's called Mao and American Socialists. You can watch it. It's a whole class I gave on this history. But it was called the new communist movement. And the RCP, at first it was called the Revolutionary Union, and it was led by Bob Avakian, whose father was a federal judge from the Bay Area. And they were probably the biggest faction of what you can call the new communist movement. There was also something called the October League, which was led by Mike Klonsky. There was the Communist Workers' Party, which was a predominantly Asian American organization. And actually, there's a member of City Council here in New York City who used to be a leader of the Communist Workers' Party. Her name's Margaret Chin. The mayor of Oakland, California, for a long time, was also a former leader of the Communist Workers' Party. There aren't many Asian American communist groups, but there was this very big one called the Communist Workers' Party. It was predominantly Asians. There were non-Asian people in it as well. There was something called the Communist Labor Party, the CLP, the Communist Labor Party. They eventually dissolved. It was led by Nelson Peary. This was this whole movement of people trying to build a new communist party. So the RCP was led by Bob Avakian. And it was probably the biggest one. People estimate that around, in 1976, that was the bicentennial, right? The 200-year anniversary of the United States. The RCP staged a rally in Philadelphia to counter the bicentennial celebration, right? And their rally was called "We've Carried the Rich for 200 Years. Now let's dump them off our backs." And they got about 5,000 people at the rally. And then they had a West Coast action in California on the same day that had roughly the same amount of people. So the RCP was probably about 10,000 people in the 1970s, in 1976. So that's pretty significant. I mean, that's no communist group in the United States has anywhere near that now. I mean, unless you count DSA, but they're not really communists. They're just kind of, social democrats. I mean, that was pretty significant. And they would march with big pictures of Mao, and they were the Revolutionary Communist Party. However, the new communist movement is really kind of a sad story because the thing was, at the time, they were getting jobs in factories and trying to recruit their workers to be their co-workers to be communists. A lot of Americans didn't want to hear it. A lot of average Americans were just, it was, hey, things had been going well. It was like, it was that labor aristocracy. A lot of white Americans were right wing and conservative, and it wasn't working. At the time, China, which is who a lot of these people took their inspiration from, China's politics were shifting as well. China was moving in a different direction with the rise, after Mao died, with the rise of Deng Xiaoping. So the Revolutionary Communist Party, they split. After Mao died, some people in the Revolutionary Communist Party supported Deng Xiaoping and thought that China was still socialist, and they were kicked out. And the RCP said that China was no longer a socialist country. What's interesting, though, is that the split, if you read the papers, which are available online, you can go to the Marxist Internet Archive. They have something called the Encyclopedia of Anti-Revisionism. You can read all of this. It's all there. It wasn't just about China. It was not just about China. It was about a lot of other things. For example, one of the issues was apparently, the inability to build mass campaigns. And there was a feeling about how to build mass work. And it seemed like Bob Avakian's cult of personality, and his kind of he's described as being kind of bipolar, and that, that the way the group, operated was there were some people in the group that wanted to build like a mass movement around economic issues in the class struggle, and there were some people in the group that wanted to push Bob Avakian's ideas about, how to build a pure revolution. And they disagreed about that. They kicked out the people that still supported China. And then, as the rise of Ronald Reagan was happening, right? So 1978, you have the first major economic downturn in U.S. history since the end of the Second World War. And, so finally, all these people who are working in factories and trying to recruit their coworkers, they're saying, oh, look, finally the economy is crashing. So now our coworkers, they'll finally be open to hearing communist ideas. That's not how it worked. In response to the 1978, economic crisis, in response to it, you had the rise of Ronald Reagan. So as the USA was getting more conservative in response to the economic crisis, because white workers, they'd had it so good for so long and then things were getting worse. In response to that, you had, the RCP kind of, went into a frenzy of what you might call ultra-leftism. They would burn the American flag. The Iran hostage crisis happened. 1979, and the RCP, there were all these anti-Iran rallies that were happening where, right-wingers were gathering and, denouncing Iran and, spitting on Iran and all this. So the RCP would go to those rallies and burn American flags and chant, "It's not our embassy, it's not our embassy." And, they acted very foolish. And they would get beaten up. They had a very provocative demonstration against Deng Xiaoping at the White House that was very provocative. And they didn't like Deng Xiaoping. They thought China was not really socialist anymore. And so hundreds of their members got arrested at this very intense demonstration near the White House. And they they called for a general strike on May 1st of 1980, and it was not a general strike. It was just a bunch of RCPers marching around with flags and getting beaten up. And they seemed to be really into getting their members beaten up, and that seemed to be something that would happen. Is their members would they would kind of be in your face. They had and they still, I mean, they were notorious. They would use the F word a lot, and they were very confrontational, and they would get in the face of people who, they would get into situations where crowds of right wingers would beat them up. And that was kind of what the RCP did, and that was their thing. In the late 70s and early 80s, they would kind of go around waving red flags and shouting the F word, and right wingers would beat them up, and they would get injured, and they would feel like they were heroes because they got put in the hospital by right wingers, and some of them got killed. There were a couple RCP members who ended up dead in the late 70s. I mean, because they would get into these situations where right wingers would, I mean, it was a little bit strange. Bob Avakian went into, he left the country. He was in France. He tried to get political exile status in France, and was never granted it. But he lived in France for many decades. He felt the U.S. government was out to get him, and so, and there were some criminal charges that were eventually dropped. But he was living in France. And that's the Revolutionary Communist Party. I mean, they're still around. They're very small now. They're far, far smaller. I mean, we're talking in the 70s. This was like thousands of people. Nowadays, I there's probably less than 100 of them. And Bob is getting old, and a lot of their people have been kicked out, and it's one of the little sects. They don't support any existing socialist country. They think Cuba is capitalist. They think, China and, Venezuela are all capitalist, and only they have the one true communism. Their leader, Bob Avakian, says he has a new synthesis, right? This new theory, which is, you read the articles, it's very convoluted, and, it's just a lot. It's it's kind of almost gobbledygook. I mean, it's really incoherent, and at one point, I remember they were pushing the idea. They said, Bob Avakian said, we've got to have a solid core with a lot of elasticity. And, and it's like, what does that mean? And it's like, like long drawn out analogies. And, you look at some of their books, it's almost like, people wonder, I think there was an article that called them the left-wing version of Scientology or something like that. I think that's a little bit extreme. I wouldn't say that they're that, but they're a sect. I mean, they're a small ultra-left sect that exists. One thing that they do, they've been doing this since the 70s, really, is that whenever there's a Republican president, climate doomed, whenever there's, a Republican president in office, they think that the USA is heading toward fascism. So they will take out an ad in the New York Times with a call to impeach the Republican president, warning that we're heading toward fascism and our freedoms are being taken away. And they will organize demonstrations calling to impeach the Republican president. And they did this with Nixon, and they call it the Workers' Committee to Throw the Bum Out. They did this with Ronald Reagan, and they called it no business as usual, and they pushed the idea that if Ronald Reagan, was not driven out of office, there would be nuclear war. They did this with Bush, with the first Bush, with refuse and resist, like the USA was moving toward fascism, so we got to refuse and resist. Then under George W. Bush, they started the world can't wait, drive out the Bush regime. And under Trump, they had refuse fascism, it was called. They raise a lot of money from people that are just liberals and don't like Republicans. And they stage protests and rallies, again, pushing this idea that Republicans are fascists. And they are very hysterical. They kind of take on a hysterical tone. They use the F word, and we're all going to die. We're all going to end up in concentration camps if the Republican leader is not driven out. And it's their idea. They're trying to build a quote unquote popular front or a united front. That's what they're trying to do. It's their attempt at building some kind of mass organization. But it's not. I mean, that's what they're doing. And, it's one of the groups. I mean, it's one of the pathetic little communist groups that has very, very little influence. And there's a number of these groups, and they all they do their thing. And, RCP, that's what they're good at. And to their credit, they have protested police brutality for years. long before it was trendy, it used to only be communists that would protest police brutality. The black community would protest police brutality, black nationalists and communists. And it was taboo. The TV news wouldn't talk about it and such. And, the RCP, they would protest police brutality. And they had a relationship with a lot of the family members of people who've been killed by police. And they raised the issue. They published the Stolen Lives book, just names of and stories of people killed by the police. And, you know, um, you know, um, that's certainly admirable. I wouldn't dismiss them. If you really want to learn the history of the group, I would encourage you to check out my lecture, Mao and American Socialists, because I talk about them, where they came from. I also talk about other Maoist influenced groups. I talk about the Communist Party USA and their relationship with China, etc. So there you go. Okay, so I was asked praxis ideas, and I think that's the same person who also asked, how can we help communism happen? So I'm going to answer both of those. The main thing we need to do is change people's minds. We need to get to the masses. We need to get out of the movement and get to the masses. And that's why I'm building the Center for Political Innovation. And we are trying to get out of the movement and get to the masses. And that means getting our literature out there. That means organizing a study group. If you want to do something, if you want to know practice, right? It's the pandemic, so you may have to do it remotely. I mean, restrictions are starting to be lifted. Organize a reading group around this book, right? We Are City Builders, the Center for Political Innovation Educational Manual. That's why I put out this manual, so people could organize study and reading groups around it. So, start organizing a reading group of We Are City Builders. And get people to read it and discuss it. Every section has questions at the end, questions for discussion, and we need to change people's minds. The current, Marxist communist movement has no understanding of what's going on with Venezuela, with China, and all of that, and focuses on a culture war against Middle America, not economics. So in order for there to be really change, in order for things to really change. There's plenty of protests happening. World's not getting any better because people don't know what they're protesting for. And we really need to get to the masses. So I would encourage you, if you want to, for praxis, if you want to help it, we need to get to the masses with this literature, with this understanding, with the understanding in this book, right? We need to get that old-fashioned class struggle ideology to the masses. All right, people in the third world mourning Prince Philip. It's an example of hegemony. I think partially it's due to the fact the British Empire was so big, so many parts of the world were colonized by the British, and that especially we don't see this so much in the United States. We're a little bit shielded from it. We see it a little bit, but especially in Europe, there is there's a huge amount of fascination with royalty still, right? Of people that just love royalty. Right, you know what I mean? And there are magazines and there are books and conferences, and there's a lot of people that they're in awe of kings and queens and princesses and duchesses, and it's a thing that they pay attention to. And here in the United States we're a little bit protected from it, but for a lot of the world, and Europe included, as well as the developing world, this is, it's a version of celebrity culture in the United States, but it's a thing, right? We've never had a monarchy here in the USA. So because of that, we haven't ever, developed the level of like worship that we get. But some people, that it's just a thing they really like. And I think that, the fact that the evil of the British Empire and what they've done around the world, the genocide they've committed, has been obscured. If you think of mass murderers, right? You think of Hitler. Well, you're right, he's a mass murderer for sure. But if you think of, no one thinks about the British Empire, even though that was a mass murdering institution. I mean, they murdered all kinds of people. But it's kind of been obscured. All the famines, the man-made famines in Ireland. Is there any way to get a signed copy of We Are City Builders? Yeah, send me an email, calebmaupin@gmail.com. I can make that happen. Um, you know, um, but no one thinks about how much evil the British Empire has carried out and how much free market economics that they pushed, the Adam Smith free trade system, how many people it's killed. So people don't associate the British monarchy. Um, Excellent. Excellent, old gringo. I'm glad. And I hope you can start a reading group, because people should be discussing this stuff. And but yeah, people don't understand how much evil there is. So there you go. Alrighty. Okay, next question. Dostoevsky and Solzhenitsyn's anti-communism. Well, Dostoevsky, right? Dostoevsky, he wrote Crime and Punishment. He was kind of, his whole thing was, it was kind of a, you should live a moral life and be religious, rather than being a revolutionary. Uh, and he's considered very important for existentialists, right? And he was a very important Russian novelist who raised the question of philosophy and free will in his writings. He was very religious and Christian oriented. Solzhenitsyn is a little bit different than Dostoevsky. Solzhenitsyn is like a straight up anti-communist propagandist, and I mean he wrote the Gulag Archipelago and other stuff, and he was somebody who was a deeply religious Russian Orthodox person who was a czarist, and he hated the Soviet Union. And he wrote novels that were anti-Soviet and nonfiction that was anti-Soviet that was published and promoted in the West. And he was friendly with Franco, the fascist dictator of Spain, and he was friendly with all kinds of far right-wing extremists, and he wanted to put the Tsar back on the throne. That was his viewpoint. He was a deeply conservative person. Now, his writing style, there was a lot of people writing stuff like that during the Cold War, but he was a good writer. I mean, he was a much better writer than a lot of those people putting out anti-communist stuff. So, there you go. I'm not a fan of Solzhenitsyn at all, but he exists, right? And I think what the sad thing is, a lot of conservatives that I've met, all they know about communism is Solzhenitsyn, and I'm sorry, but Solzhenitsyn is, that's one perspective, right? But like you listen to Jordan Peterson talk, he has read, I swear, one book on the history of the Soviet Union, and it's the Gulag Archipelago. It's like, that is one perspective, right? And the weird thing is, now there are many Russians who are, like Solzhenitsyn, deeply religious, like Solzhenitsyn, they admire the history of the czars and Russia's traditions, but who also have a high opinion of Stalin and think that Stalin was a great leader of the country who industrialized the country and defeated the Nazis and mourned the loss of the Soviet Union, right? So that's like, I'm just telling you, there are a lot of Russians who are deeply religious, deeply patriotic, and have pro-Soviet feelings, right? So thinking that by reading Solzhenitsyn, you understand how every Russian thinks about these things. No, you understand how Solzhenitsyn saw these things. And yes, a lot of the sentiments that he had, there are people around the world and people in Russia who feel that way for sure. And Solzhenitsyn is admired by many Russians. There's also many Russians who admire Joseph Stalin. And that's the arrogance that people who read Solzhenitsyn always feel like they are now experts on everything related to Russia. And it's like, no, even among people who share his Orthodox worldview, Orthodox nationalist worldview, there are still, pro-Soviet feelings. The collapse of the Soviet Union was a disaster. The Soviets defeated the Nazis. There's a lot of pride in the Soviet era in Russia. It's not as simple as you think. Right? These things are not as simple as you think. And that's, I say the same thing about Iran. People want to be like, oh, Iran, they hate communists. Iran executed communists after the revolution. That's true. But Iran is also very friendly with Venezuela. And, Iran condemns American imperialism. And they call their system not capitalism, but Irani. The world is more complicated than you think. Right? And a lot of people think they understand these things because they can get they read Wikipedia. And they think they can understand these things. And no, that's not how the world works. The world is much more complicated than Wikipedia, all right? And the reason that people support political movements is not because they read their Wikipedia pages and came to the conclusion. At the end of the day, and I've said this before, right? Think about normies, right? We all talk about normies, right? People that aren't hyper-political, right? Most people in the United States who are Democrats, why are they Democrats? Well, because they come from an area where people are Democrats, their parents are Democrats, the people who they work with are Democrats, they went to school with Democrats, and, so they're Democrats. And most people in the United States that are Republicans, well, their parents were Republicans. They live in an area where a lot of people are Republicans. The people they work with are Republicans. The people they go to school with are Republicans, so they're Republicans. That's how most people think about politics, okay? Right? So you have to remember that when you're talking to people from different countries, right? You know, I mean, look, you go to Cuba, there's some people that are going to be like, "Oh, I love Fidel Castro." Why? Because they're from an area where everyone liked Fidel Castro, and they went to school with people who liked Fidel Castro, and no, they're not reading it at the intense level that you are, and they're not considering. No, they're just normal people. They're from an area where everyone likes Fidel Castro, and they everyone they went to school with likes Fidel Castro, and they like Fidel Castro. But you go to Miami, you're going to meet people. They're from an area where their whole family hated Fidel Castro, and they're surrounded by people who hate Fidel Castro, and everyone they went to school with hates Fidel Castro, and so they hate Fidel Castro. Like, that's how most of the world, that's most people in the world. We are the minority of people that are intensely interested in politics, okay? I have my whole rant about revolutionaries are like dentists, etc. Most people are not as intensely interested in politics as we are. And so when you're talking to people about politics, right, you have to remember that. And that, that often the reason people support ideas like communism or fascism or, all right, CPUSA, communism or fascism or Islam or Christianity or Catholicism or, I mean, a lot of times reason people support these movements is not like really, really, it's not like people have sat there and debated it and come to really deep, it's not like that, right? It's like that for us because we're weirdos. We're intensely political people. We're the exception, right? But for most people in the world, they don't think about these things, right? So the fact that there are a lot of people in Russia who admire both, Tsar Nicholas II and, love the Russian Orthodox Church and love Stalin, to us, that sounds completely ridiculous. But there's a lot of people in Russia who that works, right? They love Russia. They love the country they live in. The czars and all that made Russia great. Stalin made Russia great. Stalin defeated the Nazis. He industrialized the place, wiped out illiteracy, built a bunch of power plants. So they like Stalin. He did good things for the country. They're also proud of the czars and the Russian Empire, and that works, and it just works, right? And, in America, the United States is this foreign country that is always trying to hurt Russia and put sanctions on them and ruin their economy, and, so they don't like the United States. And Stalin and, the czars are something that is Russia's identity that's different than America. It's like that in China, too, right? In China, right now, Confucianism, which is traditional Chinese culture, deeply conservative, and Maoism, which is revolutionary Marxism, are walk hand in hand, right? And most Chinese people now, they like Mao and they like Confucius. And during the Cultural Revolution, Mao tried to wipe out all Confucius. He was against Confucius, right? Confucius was deeply conservative and would have been very opposed to anybody doing what Mao did and having a revolution. But it doesn't matter, right? Because nowadays, a lot of Chinese people say, look, we're China. We're trying to raise ourselves out of poverty. And, the United States is trying to, roll back our socialist system and isolate us. And, Mao is a great revolutionary leader who did great things for our country. And Confucius is a great traditional teacher who laid out our traditional Chinese culture. And they're both just an aspect of the Chinese identity that is separate from the West. And you could say the same about a lot of, I mean, that's the thing, right? It's like, again, it's not, they're not sitting there hammering out the ideology the way you and I do. It's like, no, it's like, this is our country, this is our community, and we're not America, and America is screwing with us, and America is trying to hold us back from developing. And so we're going to take pride in Confucius and Mao, or Stalin or the czars, and we're going to take pride in aspects of our history as a country that make us separate from the West, right? And that is how a lot of people in countries like this see this, right? That and that's, there's many countries that are like that. When these countries have broken free and started developing economically, the ideology that average people have is very eclectic, right? It's very, they draw from this, they draw from that, and that I think that, this is something we have to realize, that one of the problems with really existing socialism, in the 20th century, was there was this expectation that everyone would be an ideologue, right? So even democratic centralism, right? The Leninist concept of democratic centralism can be a little bit problematic. You cannot expect everyone to agree about everything. The reason there's a million different little communist groups in the United States is because, you can't agree about everything, right? Communism is a very complicated philosophy, and there's a lot of different interpretations and views. Well, Leninism says, oh no, we have the party line, everyone must agree. So if you disagree, you got to start your own group. Well, it's very unrealistic to think you can have an organization of thousands of people or millions of people and they're all going to agree. But the problem of really existing socialism was that they took it further. They didn't just want the party to agree. They wanted all of society to be to be as political as you and I are, and think exactly the same thing. That is not realistic, right? You cannot have a whole society where everyone thinks exactly the same thing. It's not going to happen, right? So the idea that, that you're going to build a socialist society and everyone is going to have like the exact specific interpretation of the ideology of the ruling party, that it's not realistic, right? And in Venezuela they don't do that now. And in China, they don't do that now. And you go to the socialist countries of the world, they've gotten over that. They've gotten over that. It's not realistic to expect whole nations to have a very, very specific ideology. In Venezuela, it's a socialist country. Socialism is in power. People in the government believe in socialism, but there's Trotskyites in the government. There's, Maoists in the government. There's Marxist-Leninists in the government. Their general perspective is Bolivarianism, which is like our unique Venezuelan thing. But they're not trying to get everyone in Venezuela to agree with every fine point of the ideology of Maduro. It's like, it doesn't work that way. And that's more realistic. Yeah, 21st century socialism is eclectic, right? Is much more eclectic, and that's why it kind of fits in with my whole thing about socialism with American characteristics. How we got to stop LARPing, but we also got to loosen it a little bit. DSA, they really water it down, but in being anti-imperialist and in honoring these anti-imperialist leaders and wanting to dismantle imperialism, we got to loosen it up a little bit, right? We got to not be Maoists or Hojists or Trotskyists. We got to be people who want socialism in the United States and people who want to dismantle imperialism, anti-imperialists, revolutionaries, socialists. We gotta loosen it up, because the human mind, it doesn't work that way anymore. People don't agree on everything, and it's not realistic to think that you're going to have one line that will be accepted by an entire country or even an entire organization. If your organization is going to be anything more than a little cult, which is most communist groups in the United States, um, thank you, Marta. Most communist groups in the United States are just little tiny cults, okay? And why is that? Because they want total agreement, you know? And that's not realistic. People don't totally agree. And so if you're going to have a group and demand that everyone totally agree, it's going to be a very small group. And it's probably going to develop some unhealthy practices in order to try and control people. So that's why I'm all about the Center for Political Innovation. We need to get to the masses, and we need to develop a socialism that is unique for our country and our situation, and it is not LARPing, and is actually going to work and can think scientifically and not get caught up in trying to get everyone to think the same thing. Long-term goals for the Center for Political Innovation. All right. Long-term goals. All righty. So there you go. All right. Market socialism is the only way forward. No, there's not one only way forward. Okay? There's never just one only way forward. Socialism is constantly changing and adapting, and there will be many different forms of socialism. Lula running. There will be many different forms of socialism, and there will be many different perspectives, and socialism will change so much as we head on the road toward communism. There's not one way forward, and that's, again, we need to get that through our heads. Market socialism is one form of socialism, and there will be others. All right, my energy is fading, but that's okay. All right, writing theory. Well, this is theory. I do write theory. I mean, I'm not writing new theory. I'm not coming up with a new synthesis or claiming I have like some new breakthrough. But yeah, I write theoretical material. I mean, I write about, I mean, this is we are city builders and vandals in our age. This stuff is theory. I mean, I do write theory. So, I mean, I write theoretical Marxist material. Yeah, I certainly do that. There you go. You're a climate doomer. Well, like I've said, the solution to climate change is growth. Growth is what is the solution to climate change. We need to get beyond fossil fuels. We need to, get to higher energy sources. There you go. All right. Someone's asking, should they join the Communist Party USA? Look, I don't recruit for any organization, right? I know there's a lot of people that I know that are in the Communist Party USA. They're great people, and they have a good experience in that group, and if that's good for them, that works for them. I know people that are in the Party of Communists, and they are in that group, and they feel good about it, and that's good for them, good for them. I would never tell anyone not to join a group, but I also would never tell anyone to join a group. My feeling is that, if you want to be in a communist party, fine, go ahead, right? And I've known people in many different groups. But my feeling is none of those groups have done what needs to be done, which is get to the masses. We need to get to the masses. Average Americans need to understand that socialism is the answer, and that's why I'm building the Center for Political Innovation. An educational think tank dedicated to winning average Americans to socialism. And that's what I'm doing. And you're welcome to be a member of any group and join it, or be a member of no group, right? And join it, right? It's an educational think tank. Alrighty. And there you go. Long-term goals for the Center for Political Innovation. Well, the long-term goal is that all across this country, there will be educational events and very exciting socialist meetings where people are learning about socialism. There'll be all kinds of books published. There'll be all kinds of outreach going on, people knocking on doors and finding average people and winning them to socialism. And there'll be, my hope is that the Center for Political Innovation can become the think tank that everyone is listening to, whether they agree with it or not, right? And that, all kinds of people are anxious to see what book we're going to publish next, anxious to come to our next event and hear our perspective, right? That we are a voice that is educating and pushing forward. I said I want the Center for Political Innovation to agitate the agitators, right? I want the Center for Political Innovation to educate the educators, agitate the agitators, right? That we can be a source of guidance for all the people that are getting interested in socialism, all the people who want a better America. We can be a source to push them toward anti-imperialism, push them toward genuine class struggle Marxism. It needs to be done, right? It needs to be done. And so, our next web conference will be a week from tomorrow, and it needs to get done. There you go. Lula running for president in Brazil. Lula's great. And he's become much more anti-imperialist, much more radical since he's been imprisoned. He's very popular in Brazil. Bolsonaro is running Brazil into the ground right now. Brazil is like crashing and burning under Bolsonaro. Lula da Silva was framed. He was imprisoned to keep him from running for president, and now he's out of jail. And right. So I think there's a very good chance he could be elected. But there's also a very strong deep state apparatus in Brazil, paramilitaries and groups like that, especially now that he's much more radical, are going to fight him even harder, right? Bolsonaro is tied to these militias and these paramilitary groups that are very violent and very vicious. On top of that, now that Bolsonaro is pretty solidly anti-imperialist and much closer to Maduro in his perspective, because of that, they're going to fight him harder, right? He was president for a long time, and they did, but he and what's her name, who was president before, who came after him. Both of them had a very middle of the road social democratic view. And the response to them was, Bolsonaro. Dilma Rousseff and Lula da Silva both had this centrist view. They wouldn't embrace the left. They wouldn't go full anti-imperialist. They tried to have it both ways. And it didn't work. And it got you Bolsonaro. So, if now that Lula has been pushed to the left, now that he's been through imprisonment, it's very likely that it's clear that if he gets into office, he's not going to just walk the center of the road. The Workers' Party has become more radical. The Communist Party of Brazil has much more influence now, and it's very likely that they will fight him harder, right? That they won't tolerate, and that I mean, the possibility of more violence and coup attempts and stuff is much more possible now. So, it's complicated. It's very, very complicated. But yeah, there you go. I mean, yeah, I'm glad he's out of jail, and it's infuriating to me to see what they did. And there you go. So, all right, folks. I think I think I'm gonna cut it off here. I'm a little tired, but I appreciate all of you being involved. Thanks for everything. A new upsurge in the struggle against U.S. imperialism is now emerging throughout the world. Ever since World War II, U.S. imperialism and its followers have been continuously launching wars of aggression, but the people of various countries have been continuously waging revolutionary wars to defeat their aggression. And while the danger of a new world war still exists and the people of all countries must get prepared, revolution is the main trend in the world today. Thank you, Sam. While the danger of a new world war still exists, and the people of all countries must get prepared, revolution is the main trend in the world today. Good night.